There is a man in Savannah, Georgia, who wakes up every Sunday morning at 6:15 and performs a ritual that no longer belongs to anyone. He walks to the kitchen in bare feet. The tile is cold. The house is the kind of quiet that doesn't mean peaceful. It means subtracted. Something was here once. Something warm. Something that hummed and breathed and filled the corners with a frequency he didn't know he was tuned to until the signal went dead. He makes coffee. Not with the stovetop percolator. That's gone. She took it. And she should have. It was always hers. He uses the expensive machine he bought her 3 years ago. The one she never touched. The one she said made coffee that tasted like it had no memory. He presses a button. It hisses and drips and produces something hot and efficient and completely forgettable, and he pours a single cup because there is no second cup anymore. He carries it to the back porch and sets it on the railing. The chair closest to the garden is empty. It has been empty for 5 months, but he hasn't moved it. He won't. Moving it would mean admitting that the woman who sat there every Sunday is not coming back to claim her 7 minutes of silence. 7 minutes. He doesn't know why that number. She never told him. He never asked. But every Sunday, he still counts. 1, 2, 3. He watches the dogwood tree at the far end of the yard. The same tree she used to study when he spoke too soon. 4, 5, 6. His breathing slows. 7. And then he reaches across the empty space between the two chairs, slowly, the way you reach for something you already know isn't there, and places 2 fingers against the air where her wrist used to be. Nothing. No pulse. No warmth. No whispered signal that means I'm here now. She is not here now. She will not be here again. Inside the house, on the mantel above the fireplace, there is a music box with a brass key. He winds it after every Sunday count. The melody plays for 45 seconds. Something European and sad. Something that once made a woman mouth the notes because the composition lived in her bones. 45 seconds of sound. Then the mechanism slows. Then it stops. Then the house is quiet again, and the quiet is so complete it has a texture, like scar tissue over a wound that closed but never healed. This is what remains of Harlan Crestwood's marriage. Not the shouting, not the slamming doors, not the accusations at midnight. None of that ever happened. What happened was worse. What happened was silence. Hers, deliberate and full of mercy, and his, empty and full of everything he didn't say, until the woman who would have listened was already gone. To understand why this man sits on a porch every Sunday performing a ritual no one else can see, to understand who taught him to count to 7 and why he presses his fingers against nothing, you need to go back to where this started. Subscribe to this channel, because this is a story that will change the way you think about the people who love you, quietly. And if you're not paying attention to them right now, this story is going to tell you exactly what that costs. It started the way most important things start, by accident, in a place neither of them was supposed to be. Harlan Crestwood's car died on a Saturday afternoon in July, 2 blocks from the old Hargrove mansion on Abercorn Street. Savannah in July is not a city. It's a punishment. The humidity sits on your chest like a living thing. The air doesn't move. It waits. Harlan stood on the sidewalk with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to an automated message from a tow company that promised 45 minutes. And he looked at the open front door of the mansion the way a man looks at shade when he's been standing in direct sunlight too long. He walked in because there was nowhere else to go. That's the truth. Not fate, not instinct, not some invisible hand guiding him toward the woman who had become the center of his life. His car broke down, and the door was open. That's it. And sometimes, that's all it takes. The Hargrove estate sale was the kind of event that attracts 2 types of people: dealers scanning for underpriced furniture, and romantics looking for objects that still carried the fingerprints of whoever loved them last. Harlan was neither. He was just hot and killing time. He found her in the second parlor, standing in front of a chipped porcelain music box on a table between a stack of water-stained hymnals and a brass candelabra missing 2 arms. She was turning the tiny brass key with her thumb and forefinger, slowly, deliberately, like the mechanism owed her something and she was collecting. The melody that came out was faint, something European, something that sounded the way old photographs look. Beautiful and unreachable. She was mouthing the notes, not the words, the notes, as though she knew the composition by its structure rather than its surface. He said, "You know that song?" She didn't look up. "I know the composer." He wrote it for a woman who moved to another country and never told him why. That's a lot of information for a $3 music box. She looked up then, and Harlan Crestwood encountered the face that would rearrange the next decade of his life. It wasn't a face that announced itself, not the kind that stops a room cold and demands you acknowledge it. It was particular, the kind you study longer than you intended because there was always one more detail you hadn't caught. A faint scar above her left eyebrow, thin as a thread, a dimple that only appeared on the right side, and only when she was about to say something she found privately amusing, eyes that had the quality of a conversation already in progress, like she'd been thinking about you before you arrived and had already decided how this would go. "It's not about the box," she said. "It's about what someone left behind without explaining." Her name was Delphine Rowe. She bought the music box. He bought a brass compass that didn't point north. They walked out into the heat together, two strangers holding objects that didn't work, and he asked if he could buy her a glass of sweet tea from the cafe on the corner. She said no. She said she only drank black coffee, and only from a place that didn't put syrup in everything. He asked if she'd let him find a place like that. She studied him, not his face. Him, the way you read the first paragraph of a book to decide whether the voice is worth trusting for 300 pages. Then she said, "If you can find one within walking distance, I'll give you 20 minutes. He found one, a narrow shop on a side street with no sign out front, and a barista who looked like she'd been angry since birth. The coffee was black and strong and completely unsweetened. Delphine took one sip, set the cup down, and said, "All right, you've earned your 20 minutes. Don't waste them." He didn't waste them, and she didn't leave after 20. She gave him 3 hours, and by the end of those 3 hours, Harlan understood something he couldn't yet name, that this woman was not going to be easy to know, but that the difficulty was the point. She was not a door that swung open. She was a language you had to learn, and the fluency would be worth every stumbling, awkward attempt to get the grammar right. From the very first weeks, Harlan and Delphine built a private world of rituals that had no logic to anyone outside their walls, and that was exactly what made them sacred. Every Sunday morning, she made coffee using a stovetop percolator she refused to replace. He bought her a top-of-the-line machine for her birthday during their first year together. She thanked him, put it on the counter, and never pressed the button. When he asked why, she said the percolator made the coffee taste like it had a history. He said that was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. He also never missed a single Sunday. She would pour 2 cups, carry them to the back porch, and set his on the railing while she took the chair closest to the garden. Then the rule took effect. No talking for the first 7 minutes. She never explained why 7, not 6, not 10, 7, and he never asked where the number came from, because something in the way she held herself during those minutes told him the question would cost more than the answer was worth. In those 7 minutes, Delphine was arriving, not physically. She was already there, but there was a version of her that needed silence the way lungs need air, a version that couldn't be rushed into intimacy or conversation or even eye contact without losing something essential. She needed 7 minutes to cross the distance between the woman the world required her to be and the woman she actually was. And at the end of those 7 minutes, without looking at him, she would reach across the space between their chairs and place 2 fingers against his wrist. That was the signal. It meant, "I'm here now." He learned the weight of those 4 words slowly. In the second month, he tested the boundary, spoke at the 4-minute mark, something casual, a comment about the weather. She pulled her hand back, sipped her coffee, and looked at the dogwood tree at the far end of the yard like it was telling her something more interesting than anything he had to offer. He sat in the remaining 3 minutes of silence like a man who had knocked on a door and heard it lock. When she finally reached for his wrist, she whispered, "Thank you for letting me come back." He didn't understand what she meant. He wouldn't understand it for years, but he never spoke before the 7 minutes again. They had a game they played on long drives. She called it the real answer. The rules were simple. One person asked a question, any question, and the other had to give the answer they would never say out loud at a dinner party, or to a therapist, or to the version of themselves that wanted to seem like they had it figured out. Not the polished answer, not the one designed to make you sound whole. The real one, the one with teeth marks on it from where you'd been biting it back. One night, driving home from a weekend on Tybee Island, the headlights cutting through fog so thick the road seemed to be building itself 10 feet ahead of them, she asked the question that would define everything that came after. What are you most afraid people will find out about you? He gripped the steering wheel. The fog pressed against the windshield. Somewhere behind them, the ocean was doing what it always did, existing without needing anyone to notice. That I don't actually know what I'm doing, he said. At work, in life, with you. I'm just moving fast enough that nobody's caught up yet. Silence, not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that meant she was holding what he'd said with both hands, turning it over, checking its weight. Then she said, "That is the most honest thing you've ever said to me, and I need you to know, it didn't change a single thing I feel." He blinked hard enough that the fog blurred. "Your turn," he said. She looked out the window, at the nothing that existed beyond the glass. "I'm afraid that if I stop being useful, I become invisible." He reached over and put his hand on her knee, not to comfort her, to anchor the next sentence so she'd know he meant every syllable. "You're not useful to me, Delphine." She laughed, and this was not the laugh he had heard before, the polite one, the social one, the laugh that lived in her throat and went no further. This one came from below her ribs. It was unguarded and almost startled, like Joy had walked into a room she thought she'd locked. It was the kind of laugh that happens when someone says the exact thing you've been waiting to hear your entire life and has absolutely no idea they just said it. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me," she told him, "and you have no idea why." He didn't, but he would carry that sentence in his chest for years, and long after she was gone, he would finally understand. She had spent her whole life being loved for what she provided, and he was the first person who accidentally told her she didn't have to provide anything at all. That accident was the reason she stayed, and the fact that he never did it on purpose was the reason it broke her heart when he forgot. Their love didn't live in grand gestures. It lived in the ordinary, in the moments nobody would ever photograph or describe at a dinner party because they were too small to translate and too sacred to share. She had a habit of reading in bed with her glasses pushed to the tip of her nose, one knee bent, the book resting against her thigh. He would come in from brushing his teeth and stand in the doorway for a few seconds, watching the way her lips moved when she hit a sentence she admired. A slight parting, almost involuntary, like the words were feeding something in her that had been hungry all day. When she finally looked up, she always said the same thing. "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to come warm my feet?" Her feet were cold. Always, year-round, regardless of the season, regardless of socks or blankets or the thermostat setting. He had a theory about it. He told her once, lying in the dark with her feet pressed between his palms. He said he believed she ran cold because she spent all day giving off warmth to everything and everyone around her, and by nightfall there was nothing left for herself. She told him that was scientifically absurd, but she also pressed her feet deeper into his hands and didn't pull away for a long time. He would climb into bed, pull her feet onto his lap beneath the blanket, and hold them like something fragile and essential. She would go back to reading. Sometimes she read sentences aloud, not because she thought he needed to hear them, but because certain arrangements of words made her feel less alone when spoken into a room with someone she trusted. He didn't always understand the passages she chose. That didn't matter. What mattered was that she trusted him enough to be the room. On their second anniversary, he didn't buy flowers, didn't make a reservation at a restaurant with cloth napkins and a wait list. Instead, he woke up before dawn, drove to 3 different antique stores across 2 counties, and came home with a music box. Not the same one from the estate sale. That one had been lost in a move 2 years earlier, packed into the wrong box by movers who didn't know they were handling something irreplaceable. But this one was close. Same era, same kind of brass key, same feeling of holding an era in your palm. When she opened it at the kitchen table, still in her robe, still holding her percolator coffee, the melody that rose from the box was different but near, close enough to reach back, close enough to touch the original without replacing it. Her eyes went glassy. She pressed her lips together the way she always did when something enormous was trying to fit inside a normal-sized moment, and for a few seconds she just sat there, holding the box in both hands like it was breathing. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything about that day." Most people forget the music boxes, Harlan. They remember the big things, the first kiss, the first trip, the first time you said you loved me. You remembered the thing I was holding when you didn't even know my name yet. That night, lying in the dark with her head on his chest and his thumb tracing slow lines along her collarbone, she told him something she had never told another living person. Her mother, Odessa, had been a concert pianist in Montreal before she got sick. She performed Debussy, and the music box at the estate sale, the one Delphine had been turning the key on the day Harlan wandered in from the heat, had been playing a simplified arrangement of Clair de Lune, the same piece Odessa performed the night Delphine was born. She had been mouthing the notes that afternoon because it was the only way she knew how to grieve a woman who taught her that some things are too sacred to explain. You don't talk about them. You carry them quietly and hope that the right person notices without being told. Harlan pulled her closer. He said nothing. He understood, somehow, that this moment did not need his words. It needed his silence. It needed him to hold the full weight of what she had just given him and not try to make it smaller by responding. That silence, that instinct to simply hold what she offered without reshaping it, was the most intimate gift he would ever give her, and he gave it without knowing, and she received it without saying. And that is how the deepest love works. It happens in the spaces between words, in the moments no one is performing, in the dark where two people trust each other enough to stop talking and just breathe. There are moments so perfect you wish time would just stop moving. If you've ever lived inside a moment like that, one you'd freeze forever if you could, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear about the moment you didn't want to end. But here is what nobody tells you about comfort. It is the most convincing disguise that neglect ever wore. When love is new, you pay attention because you have to. Everything is unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity demands focus. You study the other person because you haven't memorized them yet. You listen because you don't know what they're going to say. You show up fully because you haven't yet learned that they'll still be there if you show up halfway. But when love becomes familiar, when the rituals settle into routine, and the routine settles into assumption, something shifts. You stop paying attention, not because you stopped caring, but because you convinced yourself that what's reliable doesn't need maintenance. And that is where Harlan Crestwood began to lose the most extraordinary thing he would ever have. It didn't happen in a single moment. It happened the way wood rots, from the inside, so slowly that the structure still looks solid long after it's lost the ability to bear weight. By the 5th year of their marriage, Harlan had become a man who had everything and had stopped seeing any of it. The private fear that lived in his chest, that he was fundamentally unremarkable, that without someone beside him making his life look full, people would see how hollow he actually was. That fear hadn't disappeared because Delphine loved him. It had simply gone quiet. And quiet fears are the most dangerous kind, because they don't announce their return. They just start eating. It started small. He brought his phone to the porch on Sunday mornings, not to make calls, just to check. A glance at email during minute 2, a scroll through notifications at minute 4. His body was in the chair, but his attention had already left, and Delphine, who had spent her entire life reading the difference between presence and proximity, felt the shift the way you feel a temperature drop before you see the frost. She didn't say anything. That was her pattern, her flaw, the thing she had learned too young and practiced too long. That calling attention to your own needs is the fastest way to become a burden, and becoming a burden is the fastest way to become alone. So she adjusted. She made room for his absence the way she made room for everything, quietly, without announcement, absorbing the loss into her posture like a tree bending around a wound it can't shed. He started falling asleep before she finished reading aloud. She would be mid-sentence, sharing a passage that had made her feel something she wanted to hand to him, and she'd hear his breathing change. Slower, heavier, gone. She would close the book, remove her glasses, and turn off the lamp without finishing the paragraph. The sentence just hung there, incomplete, spoken into a room where the only person who was supposed to hear it had already left without moving. He started coming home later, not because work demanded it, because the office gave him something the marriage had stopped providing: visibility. At work, people asked his opinion. They nodded when he spoke. His supervisor said things like good instinct and strong call, and those phrases lit up a part of his brain that Delphine's steady, quiet love could not reach. She loved him in a frequency he had stopped being tuned to, and the office loved him in a frequency the whole world could hear. He didn't notice the morning she set out only one cup on the porch railing. He didn't notice because he'd slept through the 7 minutes entirely. He didn't notice the second time either, or the third. Delphine still sat in her chair by the garden. She still watched the dogwood tree. She still counted to 7, but at the end of the count, her hand stayed in her lap. There was no wrist to reach for. The man who used to sit beside her and wait patiently, faithfully, without understanding why, but willing to trust the rhythm. That man had been replaced by someone who looked identical, but had stopped listening to the music. And the worst part, the part that would gut Harlan when he finally understood it years too late, is that she didn't leave because she was angry. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she realized she had become the very thing she feared most: useful, invisible, and no longer worth staying for. Harlan didn't have an affair, not in the way most people define the word. He never kissed another woman, never booked a hotel room, never came home wearing a lie on his collar or smelling like someone else's perfume. If you had asked him during that period whether he was being unfaithful, he would have said no without hesitating, and he would have believed it completely. That's what made it worse, because what Harlan did was something that doesn't have a clean name, and things without clean names are the hardest to defend against. Her name was Tenley Vickers, a consultant his firm brought in for a 6-month contract. She was everything Delphine was not: loud where Delphine was measured, direct where Delphine was layered, interested in the surface of things rather than the architecture underneath. She asked Harlan questions that made him feel like a man with a trajectory. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What's your next big move? What do you want your legacy to be? Big, forward-facing, chrome-plated questions that reflected back an image of himself he desperately wanted to believe in. Not the man sitting on a porch counting to 7, the man going somewhere. He started texting her. Small things at first, an observation about a meeting, a joke about a client. Harmless. Except it wasn't harmless, because the observations were the kind he used to save for Delphine. The jokes were the kind that once belonged to their drives home in the dark. And then, one evening, Tenley asked him a question over text. What's something you've never admitted to anyone? And he gave her a real answer. He typed it out with his thumbs while Delphine was reading in the next room with her glasses on the tip of her nose, waiting for him to come warm her feet. That is where the betrayal lived. Not in a hotel room, not in a kiss. In the relocation of his most honest self, the moment he took the parts of him that Delphine had spent years earning access to and handed them to a woman who had done nothing to deserve them, while the woman who had built a cathedral around his vulnerability sat 12 feet away, wondering why the house had gone so quiet. Delphine found the messages on a Thursday evening, not by searching. She wasn't the kind of woman who checked phones or opened drawers that didn't belong to her. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and the preview showed enough. A name she didn't recognize, a tone she did. She picked up the phone and read the thread standing at the counter with her shoulders straight and her weight evenly distributed, the same posture she'd had at the estate sale the day they met, studying something that contained far more information than its surface suggested, reading not just the words but the architecture behind them, recognizing, with the precision of a woman who had spent her life understanding compositions by their structure, exactly what she was looking at. She set the phone down. She cooked dinner. She asked him about his day when he came downstairs with wet hair, and she listened the way she always listened, fully, with her entire body angled toward him like he was the only frequency in the room. She gave nothing away, not because she was hiding, because she had already arrived at the conclusion, and the conclusion did not require a performance. That night, after he went to bed, Delphine walked to the back porch alone. She sat in her chair by the garden. The yard was dark. The dogwood tree was just a shape against a darker shape. She counted to 7 in silence, slowly, the way she always had. And when she reached the end, she placed 2 fingers against her own wrist, her own pulse, her own signal, a woman telling herself, "I'm here now." And for the first time in her life, that was both enough and the saddest thing she had ever felt. If you know what it feels like when one single moment splits your life into before and after, share this with someone who understands, because what happens next is something no one saw coming. 3 weeks passed after that Thursday night, and Delphine said nothing. She cooked, she cleaned, she went to work, she came home. She sat on the porch and drank her coffee from the percolator and watched the dogwood tree. And if Harlan had been paying attention, truly paying attention, he would have noticed that she had stopped reaching for his wrist entirely. But he wasn't paying attention. He hadn't been paying attention for a long time, and the tragedy of those 3 weeks is that Delphine spent them saying goodbye to every room in the house, every ritual, every version of the life she had built with him, and he didn't detect a single thing He came home on a Tuesday to an envelope centered on the kitchen table like a headstone. Inside were divorce papers, not a draft, not a conversation starter, not a document that said, "Let's talk about this," signed, finalized on her end. Every page initialed in the handwriting he knew better than his own. Steady, unhurried, certain. A yellow sticky note on the front page, written in the same hand that had once composed music he didn't know existed. "I hope the next person gets the version of you I always believed was coming." No screaming, no clothes in garbage bags on the front lawn, no midnight phone call soaked in accusations. Delphine Rowe left her marriage the same way she had existed inside it, with precision, with dignity, and with a silence so complete it was louder than anything Harlan had ever heard. He sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes without moving. Then he called her. No answer. He texted. 5 messages in a row, each one more desperate than the last. Read receipts turned on. No reply. He drove to Brecken's apartment. Her sister, the one who had never liked him, and now had permanent permission to say so. The door opened, and Brecken stood in the frame with her arms crossed, and her face carrying the particular expression of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment for years. She said 4 words. "She's done, Harlan." He signed the papers because he didn't know what else to do. The absence of a fight disoriented him. He had been prepared for wreckage, for the kind of loud, visible destruction that at least confirms the thing being destroyed had mattered. Instead, he got a clean incision, surgical, bloodless on the surface. And in the weeks that followed, he told himself the story that every man tells when a woman leaves without begging him to stay, that the ease of her departure proved she hadn't loved him the way he thought, that a woman who truly cared would have fought. That lie held his weight for exactly 31 days. On day 32, he went into the spare bedroom to pack the last of her things. Most of what she owned was already gone. She had moved with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. No drama, no hired crew, just a few trips with her car and Brecken's SUV while he was at work. What remained were the things she had chosen to leave, a few books she'd already read, a scarf she knew he liked to see hanging on the hook by the door, and a box. It was sitting on the floor of the closet, a medium-sized cardboard box sealed with packing tape. On the top, in her handwriting, the same careful, unhurried script, were 5 words. "For when you're ready to know." He sat on the floor of the spare room with the box between his knees and pulled the tape. The first thing he found was a document, a deed transfer, dated 7 years earlier. Harlan's father, Glenn, had nearly lost the family home during a medical crisis. A predatory lender, compounding interest, a debt that grew teeth faster than a retired man on a fixed income could fight it. At the last possible moment, the debt had been settled. Anonymously, Glenn called it a miracle. He told Harlan at Thanksgiving that year, his voice cracking, that someone out there still believed in doing right by people. Harlan had assumed it was a church fund or a distant relative with a guilty conscience. The deed transfer told a different story. Delphine had liquidated the trust her mother left her, the full inheritance from Odessa's estate, every dollar the concert pianist had saved and set aside for her daughter's future, and used it to pay Glenn Crestwood's debt. She had done it quietly, through a third-party attorney, structured so that no name was attached. She never told Glenn. She never told Harlan. She never told anyone, because telling would have turned a sacrifice into a transaction. And Delphine had learned from her mother that some things are too sacred to explain. Harlan set the document on the floor and pressed his palms against his eyes. The second thing he found was a letter, formal stationery, heavy stock, embossed with the seal of the Berkman Faculty of Music at a university in Montreal. It was dated the year before they married. A formal offer, a tenure-track professorship in classical composition, extended to Delphine Rowe on the basis of a portfolio the dean described in the accompanying note as the most structurally inventive work this committee has reviewed in a decade. The dean had added a handwritten line at the bottom. "We rarely see this kind of mind. Please don't waste it." Attached to the letter, paper-clipped with a neatness that felt like a wound, was Delphine's reply. A single paragraph. She thanked the committee for their generosity. She cited personal commitments in Georgia as her reason for declining. She wished them continued excellence. She signed her name. Personal commitments in Georgia. That was him. He was the personal commitment. She had been offered the professional recognition her mother never lived to see her achieve, a seat at the table of the thing Odessa had given her life to, and she had folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and mailed it back so she could stay in Savannah with a man who was just beginning to let her see who he really was. Harlan sat on the floor of the spare bedroom with the letter in his hands and tried to breathe. The air came in broken, short, shallow pulls that couldn't reach the bottom of his lungs because something enormous had taken up residence in his chest, and there was no room left. He opened the third item, a leather-bound journal, the kind with unlined pages and a strap that wrapped around the cover. It wasn't a diary. It was a composition notebook. Every page was filled with handwritten musical notation, dense, intricate, layered, a private language of melody and structure that he had never known she spoke at this level. She hadn't just studied music. She hadn't just appreciated it. She had been composing, quietly, in the margins of a life she had built around a man who never once asked what she was writing when she sat at the kitchen table late at night with a pencil and a far-off look in her eyes. Tucked into the back cover was a single loose page. At the top, a title, Harlan's Theme, unfinished. Below the title, a note in her handwriting, for the man who remembered the music box, to be completed when he remembers me. He closed the journal. He pressed it against his chest with both hands, the way he used to hold her cold feet beneath the blanket, like he was cradling something fragile that he had not protected. And for the first time since she left, the confusion evaporated. The anger dissolved. The self-serving lie that her quiet departure meant she hadn't loved him. That story collapsed under the weight of what he was holding, and in its place came a grief so precise it had an address. He had been living in a cathedral, and he had called it just a house. If this story is sitting in your chest right now, if you're thinking about someone whose quiet love you might not have fully seen, hit that like button. Not for me, for the Delphines of this world, who carry everything and never ask to be noticed for it. The revelations did not stop with the box. They continued in smaller, quieter waves, each one adding another brick to a structure of understanding that was becoming too heavy to carry and too true to set down. He learned from Corso, his oldest friend, that during the year Harlan had been passed over for a promotion and fallen into a depression he refused to acknowledge. Delphine had quietly contacted Corso every 3 days, not to complain, not to process her own exhaustion, to ask how Harlan seemed when she wasn't in the room, what he said when he thought no one was watching, whether he was eating, whether the light behind his eyes had dimmed further or held. She had built an invisible scaffolding of care around him, checking the perimeter, reinforcing the weak points, making sure the structure held, while Harlan walked through that year believing he was standing on his own. He learned from his accountant, during a routine review of his portfolio, that the seed money for his side investment, the one that finally paid off, the one that made him feel like he had accomplished something with his own hands, the one he mentioned to colleagues at happy hours and cited as proof that he had instincts worth trusting, had been quietly routed through a secondary account that Delphine had funded. She had structured it through an old insurance policy return so that it looked organic, self-made. He had bragged about that investment to Tenley Vickers. He had listed it among his accomplishments while texting a woman who hadn't earned his honesty, using money that came from a woman who had earned everything and asked for nothing. He called Brecken. She agreed to meet him at a cafe 4 months after the divorce was finalized. She came alone. She ordered black coffee, the same kind Delphine drank, and she looked at him without pity, which was worse than pity, because pity at least contains softness. She told him that the Montreal position had been offered a second time, 2 years into the marriage, a higher salary, a dedicated research grant, a personal letter from the dean saying they had held the seat as long as they could because they didn't want to lose her. Delphine had declined again. Brecken stirred her coffee slowly. She told me, "He's just starting to let me see who he really is. I'm not leaving before he finishes." She set the spoon down and looked at Harlan the way a doctor looks at a scan that confirms what everyone already suspected. "You finished, Harlan. Just not the way she hoped." He drove to Montreal in November, 12 hours on the highway with nothing but the engine and his own breathing and the slowly accumulating understanding that every mile north was a mile deeper into the life Delphine should have been living all along. He found the university. He found the music building, a stone structure with tall windows and the kind of quiet authority that comes from housing something that matters. He stood outside in the cold with his coat zipped to his chin and his hands in his pockets, and he watched through a second-floor window as she led a small seminar. She was standing at the front of the room, 8, maybe 10 students arranged in a half circle, and her hands, Those hands that used to trace the ridge of his spine in the dark, that used to reach across the space between two porch chairs to press 2 fingers against his wrist. Her hands were moving through the air, shaping something invisible into something that made sense, conducting a conversation between silence and sound that only she could hear, and teaching a room full of young people how to hear it too. She looked like the woman he had met at the estate sale. Not younger, not the shallow version of that statement. She looked like the version of herself she had been putting on hold, the one that existed before she decided that loving him was more important than becoming who she was meant to be. She looked like Odessa's daughter. She looked complete. She saw him through the glass. Their eyes met across the distance, through the window, through the cold, through the years that sat between them like a country neither one could cross. And she didn't look away with anger. She didn't flinch with pain. She didn't cry or mouth a word or press her hand to the glass like a woman trapped inside a life she hadn't chosen. She looked at him the way you look at a place you used to live, with a fondness that has made its full journey, from love to grief to acceptance to something quieter than all three, a recognition that what existed there was real, and that its realness doesn't obligate you to return. Then she turned back to her students, and her hands kept moving. Harlan stood at that window for a long time, long enough for the cold to stop feeling like cold and start feeling like the temperature of the truth. Then he walked back to his car, pulled out of the lot, and drove 12 hours south to Georgia in complete silence. No radio, no phone calls, no podcast filling the air with someone else's thoughts, just the highway and the hum, and the unbearable, irreversible understanding that the quietest woman in his life had been the loudest act of devotion he would ever witness, and he had turned the volume down, degree by degree, until he couldn't hear her at all. The music box sits on the mantel in an empty house in Savannah, Georgia. Every Sunday morning, Harlan Crestwood winds the brass key. The melody plays for 45 seconds, something European and sad, something that once made a woman mouth the notes because the composition lived in her bones before it ever lived in the air. 45 seconds of sound. Then the mechanism slows. Then it stops. Then the house is quiet again, and the quiet has become the loudest thing he has ever known. He sits on the porch with 1 cup of coffee. He counts to 7. He reaches across the space between 2 chairs and places 2 fingers against the air where her wrist used to be. No pulse, no warmth, no signal that means I'm here now. She is not here now, but he does it anyway, every Sunday, because Delphine spent years trying to teach him something he was too comfortable to learn: how to be still, how to listen for something sacred that doesn't announce itself, how to recognize that the people who love you the quietest are often carrying the most, and the moment you mistake their silence for absence is the moment you begin losing the only thing that ever made your life extraordinary. He understands that now. He understands it the way you understand fire after it has already taken the house, completely, permanently, and far too late to save anything. Some lessons don't arrive in time to rescue you. They arrive in time to make sure you understand exactly what you lost, so you spend the rest of your life building the kind of man who would have deserved it. Harlan counts to 7 every Sunday. He never once reaches a wrist, but he is learning, slowly, alone, and in the silence she always told him was enough, how to become the man she believed was coming. He just hopes, wherever she is, that she finished the composition. If this story changed something in you, if it made you want to pay closer attention to the person who's been quietly holding your world together, subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell here is designed to make you see what you almost missed before it's gone.